All right, Chris, welcome back onto the show. It's lovely to see you again, my friend. How are you doing today?
Hello, Rob. Yeah, very well, thank you. Good to be back.
Good stuff. Well, today we're going to be concentrating on talking to our athletes about the transition that's happening at the moment. I was very hopeful as we were talking that I'd be able to talk about the transition between winter and springtime training and draw a parallel with how the weather improves. But I'm looking at the window at the snowstorm that's starting to blow across the horizon. Doesn't feel as though winter has ended in terms of the seasons here today.
No, we don't learn every single year this happens, and the temperature goes to 8 degrees, and we all think it's summer again, and it's just not. Take your time, everyone.
The groundhog saw its shadow this year for sure where I live. I think we've got snow forecast here for the next 14 days. So yeah. So anyway, and that's fine. We'll talk about that because it's really important, I think, to address how plans on paper might not always work out for plans in the real world. And just because we've said the winter block is ending doesn't mean winter's ending. How can we adapt training? How can we be smart? All of that stuff is going to feed into the real world, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. I think that probably leads us quite well into kind of pressing pause for the athletes. And it's kind of a slight moment of reflection of reminding ourselves where we're at in our race season and training phase. So I think if I pose you the question, Rob, of what was the purpose of this winter block, assuming that the athletes listening are kind of at the process of either finishing their last couple of weeks, or maybe you've actually just finished your, call it 16-week winter block. Remind us and remind it to the new listeners on what was the actual purpose of that 16 weeks.
Yeah, it's a great question, Chris. And I think a lot of the athletes we coach, they are either have just finished or are coming to the end of their winter block or their FTP building block that we describe it as. And to take a step back from it, especially for athletes who aren't coached by us or who are new to the show, we approach the process of coaching and training athletes for long distance events slightly differently to the traditional approach, which is essentially winter is the time for doing lots of long, slow miles. And as you gradually get closer to your summer event, you gradually ramp up the intensity. And as you get closer to your goal event, you're doing the most intense, the shortest, the hardest sessions of the year. And that theory holds true really well for track runners who are running 800 meters, 1500 meters. By the very nature of it, they have to be specific for the training they're doing for their events. So they have to do their shortest, hardest, fastest sessions closest to their event in order to be ready. Where I don't think it holds up so well is if you're racing long distance events. And in my book, any triathlon, any endurance event is a long distance event. Even a sprint triathlon is over an hour long, which in context is longer than most of the events that any runner will ever do, So it doesn't make sense in this context of long distance triathlon and endurance events to do the shortest, hardest, fastest sessions closest to your event because they're not the ones that are most specific. And if we take the example of a marathon runner or an Ironman triathlete, the most specific sessions for them are going to be the longest endurance sessions. It doesn't matter how hard you're going on a 6-hour ride to a certain extent. It's the duration of that ride that's the most important thing. And arguably, if you go out too hard and you only do 3 or 4 hours of your 6-hour ride because you've gone too hard, there's no benefit in order to say, I went too hard, but it's fine because I finished after 4 hours. It's totally blown. The idea of it is you're training to be able to last the length of the race that you're going to be doing. All of which is a long way around to saying, if you're going to do your longest endurance training events in the run up to your long race, when are you going to fit in the time to do the shorter, harder events that are going to increase your overall aerobic fitness? And so that's the way we structure winter. We do a really intense block of FTP training on the bike in order to increase our engine size during the winter. And then as we approach our race season, we gradually extend the length of those rides. And if we've got it right, which we hopefully will do in almost all cases, what athletes find when they transition to training outside again after the long, cold winter is they're going faster for the same effort when they go outdoors. So all that hard work on the turbo trainer translates to riding at, I don't know, 31 kilometers an hour on the Sunday ride rather than 27 kilometers an hour on the Sunday ride. They're not trying any harder. They're riding at the same relative percentage of their FTP. It's just that their FTP is now bigger. Their engine size has grown, so the engine doesn't need to work any harder, but you'll be going faster. That's essentially the summation of our winter training philosophy, I think.
I think that makes total sense, Rob. And I think a little cherry on top is that the majority of our athletes are UK based, European based, or in America, for example, but the climates are pretty harsh in the winter. And so I have a lot of conversations with athletes, and at times they're struggling to get a 2 or 3 hour ride done at the weekend because of weather, because of lack of daylight. So if we were to flip that on its head and actually say, no, we're going to do an FTP build in the build up to your race, but actually in winter, we're going to stick to the very slow aerobic easy miles. In reality, I don't think we'd get many athletes through that. You know, doing 3-4 hour rides 2 or 3 times a week in the winter, our athletes aren't full time. And so they're balancing work, they're balancing family, and it's just not realistic. So I soon went to the same philosophy through my training as well. And I actually tried what you call the more traditional base training. And I didn't last long at all. I was based in the UK, trying to ride big miles, trying to run big miles in the winter. By the time I came out of the winter, I was already cooked. I wasn't able to get the benefit out of the next phase of training. So for me, it makes absolute total sense.
Yeah, it's partly reacting to the reality of how much time you've got to train. Because if you have 40 hours a week to train, well, there's no argument. I'm not going to stand here and say to people, if you had 40 hours to train, the best way to spend them wouldn't be to do a 7-hour-a-week training plan. It just wouldn't. It would be to do more training because you got the time. But if you're trying to fit that in around a full-time job, around childcare, around family, around friends, all of that kind of stuff, and trying to find a way to train safely on the bike in the wintertime, it's very, very challenging. And so this philosophy is really grown out of a kind of real world response to, well, what's the best way to spend the time that most athletes have living in Northern Hemisphere winter? And it's interesting, actually. I think that Zwift has changed the game in the last 2 or 3 years. The pandemic changed the game. Before this, a lot of people really hated turbo trainers. They were seen as not even as a necessary evil, just as an evil. You know, it was a thing that you went to do to punish yourself, and people call their pain cave that for a reason. Zwift has changed that to mean that indoor training is actually enjoyable now. The variety of routes you've got to ride, the fact you don't have to essentially bury yourself every single ride in order to get through the workout has really changed that. But that wasn't the case 10 years ago. And so it's grown up as a reaction to how to make the best use of what for most people is limited training time and limited daylight hours as well, essentially. I think that's the key thing. It's helping people make the most of the time that they've got.
Totally. And in terms of, you know, we kind of touched on cycling and the FTP build. We've done 2 or 3 podcasts now on swimming, and hopefully the listeners have gone away and they're really focusing on what we think is the main element of swimming, which is technique. So can you talk to us a little bit about, over the past 16 weeks, what you have expected, at least our athletes and hopefully new listeners, to have focused on over the 16-week period in the water?
Yeah, well, I think it's also really important to recognize that there's a certain truth to the idea that you can't hammer yourself all year long. You just can't, because you're going to end up, as you described, completely flat at the time of year when you need to be most ready and willing and mentally able to train. So if you keep pushing yourself to do fitness training all year round, all the time, what's going to happen is you get to 4 to 8 weeks out before your race and you just can't do the training you need to do. And so that feeds in very nicely to the fact that we have to improve our swim technique at some point of year. And the time to improve our swim technique is when we're furthest away from our race, so that as we transition into fitness training, if you like, we're doing so with an improved set of stroke techniques. Same principle holds true. You're then moving through the water faster for the same effort. So that's essentially where we spend all of our time in the pool during the winter, is saying to people, there will be some specific drills that you try that you find incredibly difficult, and probably the lifeguard wanders over and sees if you're okay because you just can't make the drill work. But whatever that drill is probably the one that's going to move you through a swim stroke floor or swim stroke plateau in order to be able to swim faster when you return to swim fitness training. Now, that's not to say we just have athletes just do technique work all the time, but the vast majority of the focus is, can I get myself to the point where I am swimming faster for the same effort by intelligent use of specific swimming drills designed to correct one of the three major problems that all age group swimmers have? So the three problems are either going to be, number one, with the catch and pull at the front of the stroke, number two, with the body position, keeping them level in the water, or number three, it's going to be trying to keep their sort of their body rotation coordinated with the front end of the stroke. One of those three things is always the issue with athletes who are struggling to swim fast, because most of the athletes we have are already very aerobically fit. If you're riding 90K in 3 hours and you're getting in the pool and you can't break 3 minutes for 100, the problem is not fitness. Because it's the same body, the blood is moving around, the oxygen's going in and out the muscles. It's application of your force to the water that's the problem. And doing more swimming isn't going to change that. It's got to be changing the way that you swim and apply that force to the water. And it's not unusual to see when, I mean, as you'll know, when something clicks for an athlete in the pool and they make that breakthrough change in the technique, they can be 10 seconds, 100 faster in the click of the fingers. Because it's not this, and we really struggle with that, don't we, right? As runners and cyclists, you don't see these massive jumps in times in those sports, but you can in swimming. You can have a genuine breakthrough where you go, oh, okay, you know, that hip should be moving up as that foot goes down. And all of a sudden, the rotation clicks and you're powering through the water. So that's the thing I really love about swimming, the fact that someone who's kind of given up on ever being any good at it can have this massive jump and improvement in almost the click of the fingers.
Exactly. And I think this is a really timely conversation. And it's one that I've had with a lot of athletes recently. And it's, I mean, for me, there are two parts. It's don't fall into the trap of trying to swim a little bit faster each session. And
right.
You touched on it there really well, which is think about your whole swimming in terms of technique. And you can do the hard work elsewhere on the bike in FTP sessions. But also you've got to think about where you're at in terms of your calendar year. And this is the perfect time to make sure that what you're doing physically is actually what you're aiming to do. So what I mean by that is, in the water, it's very easy to think that you're doing X, Y, and Z in your swim stroke, but then you get some video analysis and it doesn't even look like you. Nothing resembles the motor patterns that you actually thought you were going through. So if you feel that you're an athlete that's turning up for swims very regularly and you are applying yourself, but you're still not getting that breakthrough that Rob was talking about, then now's the time. Towards this end of this winter block, you've still got plenty of time to correct your swim stroke, but make sure that you get eyes on it. You have to see it for yourself. So either get a swim partner to film it on a phone, a camera, anything like that, or even better, get a professional coach to film you and then do a full analysis of your swim stroke, and then go away from that session with A, B, and C of what you need to do in your swim stroke. And remember, we're only in, February, March. We've got so much time hopefully before your big A race. So now's the time to do that. And don't think I'll do that next year, I'll do that later in the season. If you're going to do that, do it now, because now's the time that you're going to be able to apply the changes. And it takes a lot of time. I remember you in one of the last podcasts referring to swimming as golf, and it's the same thing. You don't change one small thing in your golf stroke and then in your golf swing, and then go and play your biggest tournament of the year the following week. It takes time, and you've got the luxury of time right now. So yeah, get on the internet and look for your local professional swim coach, and that is so valuable.
Yeah. And to go back to what you said, that the phase one of that, even seeing yourself swim on video for the first time, things have changed again over the last few years. It used to be that there was no way any pool manager was ever letting you in with a video camera, or, you know, for obvious reasons. And now, as more and more people are taking swimming seriously, it's really common that pools will give you have to ask the manager first, and you have to get a signed consent form. And there might be a specific time that they get you to go and swim and have someone film you. But almost all the pools that we used used to allow that, certainly within specific tri-club sessions. And all you need to do is see yourself swimming from above the water to realize that what you think you are doing isn't what you're actually doing. That can be enough to help you work out, well, at the very least, I need someone to tell me what I need to change, because I can see, you know, my hand is entering where I don't think it is, or my legs are splaying behind me as I go to breathe. The really common stroke flaws, the solution to them isn't often obvious, but there is a solution to them. That's the thing. But just seeing what you're doing can make a really big difference. So dead simple to get videoed and just have a quick look at it. I know loads of the coaches I used to train for British Triathlon, this was a big topic of conversation. You know, am I allowed to just get out my iPhone, film the athletes as they're swimming and show it to them on pool deck? And the answer is, well, no, if you've not got the consent of the pool manager. So get the consent of the pool manager. And, you know if it's the consent of the athlete isn't there. But if they want you to do that to improve, absolutely. So take care of the sort of admin-y stuff, and then really make those changes. And then, like you say, it's a great time to go and have a professional swim stroke analysis done. Again, mate, 5-10 years ago, to be able to film something under the water, you know, the GoPros weren't even waterproof, and they had to have a little, do you remember the plastic housing you had to get? And we used to be duct taping it to the end of an extendable pole and walking in front of people. And now most camera phones are waterproof, and you can just, I mean, for God's sake, read the manual before you follow my advice here. But a lot of camera phones can be popped down into the water, and you can actually see what's going on under the water. So yeah, it's easy for me to sit here and say, look, there's one of three things going wrong, and the athletes are sitting at home going, well, what are these things and how do I fix them? But honestly, it's going to be one of those three things that we talked about. It's going to be body balance in the water, it's going to be connection between the hip snap and the hands, or it's going to be not using your forearm as a paddle and getting all of your arm to pull you through the water. The drills to fix it are really simple, but the first step is working out which of those things you need to personally do. And that's like the 80-20 rule. If athletes get that one thing that they can work on, it makes the change. It will make a big difference to their swimming.
Perfect. I've got one small comment that I think is really relevant for this time of year. And it was one of the first podcasts of the year that we did. And we were talking about essentially how long a season can be these days. And a lot of people's A races are obviously in the summer and even end of summer. And I think now is the time where people are probably able to analyze whether they got it right in terms of that big jug of motivation. And I've spoken to a lot of athletes that went all guns blazing first 2 weeks, 100% on race ready week after week. And then now it's slowly but surely dropping off. And you ask them, why is your consistency dropping off slightly? And you often see a swim is disappearing, or more likely than not, a strength and conditioning session. So I don't have a solution for the listener right now, but what I'm going to ask the listener to do is just press pause, have a think. This is a bit of a reset time as you focus on the next block of training, and just make sure that you're accountable to yourself, that you are confident in how you're structuring your week, your logistics, your training, your recovery, to make sure that in June, July, August, you still have the level of motivation to get you to that start line, really hungry for it, really fresh, really excited, as opposed to using all your cookies now and start to wean off. And I've done it many times myself. I've done it wrong many times myself. And I think when you have a 16-week block like this, it's a really healthy process to actually just stop a little bit and review and think, am I doing things right? And if not, now's the time to change that. And again, you've got the luxury of time. And I use the word review in that last sentence, which I think leads us on to the next bit quite well, which is, how do we review how we're getting on? Are we testing? Are we not testing? So what's your opinion on that? Obviously, the majority of our athletes, if not all our athletes, we do ask them to do a test in each discipline. But I think it'll be refreshing, Rob, if we hear your perspective on what you'd expect the athletes to be testing at the end of a 16-week winter block.
Yeah, so really briefly then, the way that we approach testing is we'll test swim, bike and run in week 1 of our winter block, in about week 8 or 9 of the winter block, which will depend on when Christmas falls, and again in week 16 of the winter block. So we've essentially got a baseline test at the start of the winter block. Halfway through, we'll have a test to see how we're getting on. And then at the end, we'll also have a test to see how we're getting on. The tests that we will actually do, we'll do a traditional FTP test on the bike. We'll talk through all 3 of these individually. The FTP test involves a 20-minute flat out time trial. And at the end of that, we see the athlete's average power, and we take 95% of that and we say, that's your functional threshold power. And that's analogous to the amount of power you could probably hold in a race if you were surrounded by other highly motivated people for an entire hour. Now, there's some caveats here, and they're important to talk about. The protocol of testing for 20 minutes to predict an hour's power number is slightly controversial, let's say, as we all know. And originally, the number 20 came out of the fact that the test was being done on your own, in the garage, in the dark, in the middle of winter, to predict what you could do for an hour in the summertime racing other people. So I'll caution people a little bit here. Zwift has changed this slightly. If you're doing your FTP test on Zwift, in a time trial on Zwift, surrounded by other people, yes, it's still a predictor, but for some people, it's going to be a better predictor than others. I think that's the best way to say it. So I know for me, if I'm doing a test on my own, or if I'm doing a test like we did, we set up those team time trials over the winter that we did sometimes, I can definitely put more power out feeling like Andy Heaps is catching me on the bike than I can on my own. And so I think my numbers are skewed a bit higher in that kind of test situation. For me, I don't think the FTP number that came out of that particular test was as accurate. It was a bit too high than the one previously, but that's something for every athlete to work out. And that's okay, as long as from test to test, they're all the same, then I think we've got a valid comparison between our 3, our baseline, our midwinter, and our end of winter tests. As long as we're all the same, that's fine. But think of them as a discrete number that's showing you progress you've made, rather than, it certainly isn't a scientific, well, I did this number in the test, so 95% of this is whatever, and I can hold that outside on the local time trial course for an hour outdoors. Just don't think it works like that, does it?
No, it's a really complicated subject, I think. And you've got to remember, let's say, we've got so many athletes doing long distance triathlon. So that can mean a 5, a 6, a 7, an 8-hour ride. Yeah. And so the reality is we only really want one test, because we want to use the majority of our time training as opposed to testing the whole time. And so we have to pick one. We could have picked a 5-minute test. We could have picked a 50-minute test. The point is that there's going to be flaws in whichever test you pick. But as long as you can replicate it season upon season and multiple times within a season, it's just benchmarking the numbers to make sure that the sessions we give you are still appropriate for your current zones. That's all it is. And so I think I've frustrated quite a few athletes this week, because I've had calls with them, and pre-test, they're looking for, what do you expect my number to be? And I'm quite honest, to be honest, at this stage, I don't really care. I just care that in that 20-minute, you give a really honest account and give it 100% for that 20 minutes. Whatever the number is at the end, it could be 10 watts below, it could be 10 watts above. And either way, I'm not going to get really excited or really panicky about it. because in the grand scheme of things, what we're testing is how good you were for 20 minutes. And that's okay. We're defining your zones. That's the point. We're not we're not getting too excited about what it is. So I think
it's not an A level, is it? That's the thing. It doesn't determine whether you get into university or not, and it shouldn't be built up to be this big thing. It's simply making sure that your zones are correct and your power levels are correct for the next block of training. That's all it is.
Yeah, there's nothing worse than an athlete guessing what their FTP is, and therefore the next 8 to 16 weeks is going to be based around a zone that an athlete feels. And as a coach, we can't just go on that feel. We actually need to see the data because we're accountable to the training that we're giving the athlete. So therefore, the test is really for the athlete, for the coach's benefit, to make sure that we're giving the correct zones at the correct time. And so if the athlete can just frame it at that and just say, okay, I see this as an opportunity for a 20-minute maximum effort, that's a great session in itself. But don't get too worried or too excited either way. It's just one metric out of many metrics that we could be using. It's just this is the one that's kind of most applicable to the majority of people. So I feel that athletes get in a bit of a twist with this FTP stuff, and it's really important. I'm certainly not saying it's not important. I truly believe that it's a fantastic metric, but I don't want too much of the conversation to be stuck in FTP and I'm 2 watts above or 2 watts below. What does that mean? It means that we're training you in the correct zone. We can now move on and get on to the next block and make sure that you're race ready. And if that's a 6-hour Ironman bike, that's brilliant. The 20-minute effort helped us guide you towards that, but it's not the be all and end all.
Do you know, it's interesting you've said that. I read a great blog yesterday by the American pro triathlete Justin Dare, who won Ironman Boulder many years ago. And one of the things he wrote on his blog was he had his best ever performance in a race in a block of training where he'd had to go to 3 weddings over 3 weekends in 3 different places in the country. And he kind of threw his hands in the air and went, this race is in 8 weeks' time. I've had a horrendous build up to it. I'm going to do the best I can, but the result doesn't matter. And he writes really eloquently about how he was at the same time bothered about the race result, but completely detached from the race result at the same time. And because of that detachment, he'd given himself permission to not obsess about the result every day, which resulted in his best training block, which resulted in him winning Ironman Boulder. And the way he writes about that mindset of, I was bothered about it, but I wasn't obsessed by the outcome of it. And I couldn't ever get that mindset back again. It's really, really interesting. I think it's the same with the FTP test on a much lower level. If you can be curious about what your result is without thinking that there's, any self-worth attached to the outcome of it, you're not a better person or a worse person because your FTP goes up or down. It's just a measure of making sure we're training at the appropriate level. And actually, if an athlete's numbers don't go up or they come down a bit, that's a positive from our point of view, because we've found out what that is and we've stopped them training too hard, because you definitely would make less progress over a block by training just too hard than you would by training just under that threshold. That's the key thing. It's a ceiling, not a target. I love that phrase. We want you to stop you going above this level, because above that level, you're going to get exponentially more tired for no more benefit whatsoever.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Rob. There's another kind of point on this, which is the 20-minute test is a 20-minute test, and that's great. And if you think about that in terms of running, we're not sending athletes to do their 20-minute absolute maximal run every X amount of weeks. And from that, we're not going to be determining exactly what their marathon time off the bike in an Ironman would be. So I think that's a good comparison of, okay, if all our athletes went to do their 20-minute run test, what would that mean in terms of a marathon prediction? It's not.
Yeah, you wouldn't try and extrapolate the two, would you? You wouldn't do a 5K and go, that means my marathon will be this. Yeah,
exactly. It just means you're getting better. You're getting better at running 5K, or you're getting better at running a 20-minute. But that doesn't mean you're better at running 2 hours or 3 hours or 4 hours off the back of a 6-hour bike, off the back of a 1 hour and change swim. So you've got to think about the context of the sport that you're in. We're not time trialists. I mean, we are to a certain degree, but we're not 20-minute specialists in anything. We're multiple hours on end of multidiscipline sports. So we're just trying to have a little window into the zones, into your aerobic system as coaches, to make sure that we're staying accountable and not just sending you off and doing monster FTP sessions by putting you 25 watts above what you should be. That's all it is. So don't, you know, people
don't make the mistakes we did.
Yeah, we've all been there. And I think athletes are losing sleep about it of, oh, I've gone down 5 watts, or I've put in all this work and I've only gone up 2 watts. But there's more nuance to it, and I wouldn't worry about it. I really wouldn't.
Yeah, 100%. And again, I think it brings us on to the next point about running. Training hard on the bike is the safest way to improve your run fitness, because the running and the biking training for triathletes fits together like this. It really does. In order to save people from getting any kind of run injuries or niggles, having them not do any hard running through the winter is one of the best things they can do. And I'm convinced that one of the reasons people make so much progress in their running with us is because they don't end up going and doing any track sessions with the club during the winter. And so they don't get a sore calf, they don't pick up a niggle, they don't get egoed into racing somebody over the last 200 of the last rep and end up with really sore hamstrings for the next 3 or 4 days. We've a lot of us have been there in the past and made those mistakes. Working really hard on the bike is a really safe way to improve your top end run fitness, and being really consistent with your running is the key to improving your run fitness. And this is one of my favorite things that happens at the end of our winter block, is when athletes say, you know what, coach, I've done all of the winter training now, I haven't done any fast running for 16 weeks in some cases. I want to go out and do a 5K, or I want to go out and do a 10K and just see where my run fitness is. And we have so many examples of athletes coming out and knocking 1 minute, 2, 3 minutes off their 10K time, having done no specific run training at all. And it's all down to the durability being so good. None of it's down to, you know, my traditional older running friends talk about needing to do the speed work during the winter. I'm not going to race well because I've not done speed work. And you think if you just stop doing the speed work, you'd be loads better, because you wouldn't have these niggles and injuries all the time. So that's the real secondary benefit, I think, of the hard FTP bike sessions, is it feeds both run and bike fitness. And that'll come on to talking about how we test running. We don't send athletes out every 4, 6, 8 weeks to do a hard run during the winter. Our run test is very deliberately a submaximal run test, where we get athletes to run at what most people would consider, I guess, to be tempo running, wouldn't it? The M pace that comes from Jack Daniels' pace predictors. It's a nice, moderately fast but sustainable pace, and they monitor the heart rate as they do this. And the mark of progress across the winter then becomes either A, they do the next test at the same pace as before and see that the heart rate is lower, or B, they do the test at an increased M pace and have the same heart rate. Either way, you're seeing that you've improved your run fitness without ever having to go to the very top end of your running and push yourself during the longest, darkest, coldest winter months for the rest of the year.
That's a really good point. I'd also suggest athletes that do go and do this test, which I think is a brilliant test, to make a note to themselves in Training Peaks or whichever system they use, and also use RPE as an extra metric on that.
Yeah.
Because I think it's we're missing a trick if we're just focusing on heart rate and pace, because even if heart rate or pace was better, but it felt worse for whatever reason, maybe their run technique starts to degrade at a slightly faster pace, or the heart rate is dropping, but actually they feel more out of breath. And there's a lot of nuance going on as well. So I think it's interesting if the athlete kind of analyzes what they've been through, look at the data, of course, but also add a comment to yourself saying, and at this pace or at this heart rate, it actually felt better or worse, and try and get to the bottom of why. Because again, if you're running long distance over a half marathon or marathon, you need to get to the bottom of that RPE, and you need to be in control of that. So Yeah,
I think the feeling thing that you've said there is so important, because that's the heart of it, isn't it? If people can feel that they're running better, our job's done. Doesn't matter what the numbers say, the heart rate, the pace, the RP, whatever. If people feel better when they're running, it feels easier for them, then that's a real mark of, because it's different, isn't it, running to being on the bike. You are physically moving your body against gravity. And so it can feel harder some days and easier other days. I think a mark of the winter training progress is the runs progressively feel better. And athletes who don't make a note of how it did feel have got nothing to kind of compare it back to and go, oh, okay, well, I guess, I love reading when an athlete writes, I can just feel that things are getting better. I can feel that my fitness is improving. That's the real main thing that is incredibly hard to quantify as a scientific point of view, but is the thing that is the most important from an athlete's point of view, I think, Chris.
Yeah, I think the athletes that I'm closely working with at the moment expect me to get really excited when I log into their sessions and see an FTP workout and some, really big numbers, felt comfortable. That's brilliant. That's great. But actually, where I get a real kick is where I see an easy 30-minute or 45-minute e-paced easy run. And I can track in January, they were making comments of, I felt a bit sluggish, legs were heavy, but it was okay. It was fine. It's usually fine because it's a very easy session. But slowly but surely, their comments are kind of disappearing on these sessions, and they're going into, yeah, that felt great, absolutely fine, nothing to report. And that's what I want to see. It's that the same session, even though it's an easy session, just feels easy and easy. And now a lot of athletes, they're kind of referring it as, it's not even a session. It's, I'm just going out for a 45-minute easy run. But that is, and 16 weeks back, that was a session to a certain degree, and it didn't always feel good. And now, week after week, those easy runs, and the pace doesn't matter that much. Again, it's that they're feeling really good. And the likelihood is, if you're feeling good whilst you're running, the likelihood is that you can keep running another half hour, 2 hours, feeling good like that. The problem is when you're not feeling good, and then obviously there's some issues to work on. So yeah, ironically, I think the athletes are expecting me to make comments on the big exciting FTP sessions, but at the end of the day, I'm getting more excited by the 30 or 45-minute easy run that is genuinely easy for them.
I love that. It's almost like there's two parts to this. There's scientifically quantifiable, measurable improvements that happen, and then there are these almost anecdotal feelings that come alongside it as well. I think from the measurable point of views, we often get asked by people, like, what kind of improvements can I expect to see across a winter? And so typically we'll answer that question. I think typically we'll see between a 5 and 10% jump in FTP across a winter block. And I'll qualify that again in a minute. We'll see about 5 seconds improvement at CSS pace, or we might not see a CSS change, but we'll see an improvement in their 400 and 200 times. We'll come back to the nuance of that as well in a minute, because that's something that drives people up the wall. And then in the running, we'll typically see 5 to 10 beats a minute less at the same pace, or flip it, 10 to 20 seconds per mile faster at the same heart rate. Now, the reason we said we'll quantify these things a minute ago, CSS pace is an absolute bugger, isn't it? In terms of showing people improvements, because it's possible, the way we'll briefly talk about the CSS measurement, it looks at your 400 time relative to your 200 time, and the maths of it divides one by the other and works out how much you've slowed down from your 200 pace to your 400 pace. And so it's possible for an athlete to actually improve both their 400 and 200 times, but end up with the CSS pace exactly the same, or some instances a second or two slower. And people are baffled, and it feels like a failure to them, doesn't it? But actually, the thing we've got to bring you back to here is to say, no, the measure of this is you are now a faster swimmer over 400 meters. It's still correct to train at the new CSS pace, because that's what's most appropriate for your training. But don't lose sight of the fact that you are improving and getting faster by training at that pace. So nothing's going to change if you keep on going. That's the key to it here, is that CSS pace is a great measure of progress, but ultimately it's the 400 and 200 times themselves that are the real measure of improvement in swimming.
And again, I'd say to the athlete, take it seriously and respect the CSS test and the number that comes out of it. But at the end of the day, again, we're looking at how quickly you can swim over two very specific distances, 400 and 200. If you're swimming 3.8K in the open water in your race, then naturally it's not the most specific test for that. But the reality is we need a test, we need a benchmark. The coaches need that to make sure that when we're giving you a CSS swim, that you're not swimming over or under that. So that's what it is. It's the word that keeps coming up with benchmarking. And obviously it's always nice to see improvement, but we can't always see improvement. So therefore take it with a pinch of salt, get excited when you do get that breakthrough, but also remember that just because you swam a quicker 400 meter doesn't always mean that you're going to swim a quicker 3.8K on race day, and vice versa. So take it with a pinch of salt and just be in that moment when you do the test, be in that moment, give it 100%, but then don't let it spiral for the next week or two and think that, oh, this works, you know, it's not actually doing the benefit that I want, because it is. But we're in endurance sport and it takes seasons upon seasons to really improve on your race performance. So keep that in mind.
Yeah, I think the CSS test, being 400 meters, 200 meters, is great at showing, are the changes that you're making to your stroke over the winter technique block, are they working? Because you will directly see them in a 400 meter time. Because as we said, it's not the fitness for 99% of the athletes that's determining the time on the clock. It's application of their technique to the water. So if things are working in the drills, you will see yourself going faster in the 400. And it's, I mean, everybody knows 6 to 8 minutes to 10 minutes worth of swimming, depending on how fast you are. It's very, very hard to swim hard for that period of time. It's like a VO2 max effort. But there's enough information coming out of that test to show you that the drills are making a difference. Something that will change as we go into our race-specific training plans going forward after the winter block. We're not going to use the CSS test anymore. We're going to change to using a much longer endurance test. We'll talk more about that next week. So you're dead right to identify, look, it's a really good test of this thing. It's not a great predictor of your swim time over 1500, 1.9, 3.8K. And so we're moving to a different test later on after that. Not to say there's anything wrong with it, but I think we can get a better and more specific set of information for our athletes going forward. Yeah.
Here's a difficult question, Rob. Sorry to put you on the spot, but I do think it's important to bring it up. And so an athlete may have been through a very similar process to the one that we've been talking about over the 16 weeks. And if they come out of that 16 weeks and they do the test that we talk about and they don't see the improvements that they either hoped for or expected, or maybe no improvement at all, what would your message to that athlete be?
I think the context of this is everything. And the most important part to remember is the test is just a snapshot of what's happened on the day and can be massively influenced by things that have happened over the last week or two. We all know personally from the last couple of weeks, illnesses that happen over the winter time can be something that can affect you in the very recent past. A couple of weeks ago, that can put a dent in the effect that the tests can have. Okay, so that's something that can play a part in it. Again, we've mentioned with swim testing, we can sometimes see people are making changes and getting faster 400s, but not seeing an improvement in the CSS time. And again, that's okay. The CSS projection is one thing. Seeing the changes in your 400 time is another. And if you're not seeing a change in your 400 time, arguably that's a good thing as well. You found out that the drills that you've been trying have not worked for you. You're going to need to go back to the drawing board and find something else, because the bottom line of that is, if you keep doing the same thing, you are going to keep getting the same result. So it's time to get some video analysis, look at what's going on. If you've been seeing one coach, see another swim analysis coach, see if another drill or another pair of eyes can help move you through that plateau. And there's also, I think there's also an element of athletes who've been at this for multiple seasons. They're kind of at a disadvantage here, because once you've got, let's say, 2-3 seasons worth of endurance training, if it's been structured the whole time into your body, the gains are not going to continue at the same rate. forever. And especially if you're entering into middle age, as we're approaching 50 and beyond, the game changes from being, can I see increased levels of gains year on year, to even getting to the point where eventually, and it's not going to be the case for everybody at the same age, but eventually we're going to get to the point where year on year, our body is going to start declining. So arguably being able to hold the same level from year to year is a win in itself, right? You're stopping that inevitable decline that happens just through loss of muscle mass, aging, whatever. So there's all those factors to go, look, this isn't the end of the world. But more important than that is just to remember the tests themselves are indicative of the training we've been doing, but they're not a predictor of how your race is going to go at middle or long distance. There's a lot more to it than 400-meter swim time, FTP, and run test time. And the benefits that long endurance history brings are much more skewed towards a long distance race performance than to a short distance FTP test or CSS test. So there's every reason to think that your race performances can still improve, even if you've seen, you know, little improvement, no change, maybe even a small decline over the winter. You can still definitely see improvements come the summertime.
This has struck a chord with me, Rob, and over the past, call it 3 years, if we use bike as an example,
don't you start telling me that your performance is declining at 34 years old.
No, it's not. It's not declining, but it's certainly plateauing to a certain degree.
The gains are plateauing, right?
Yeah, okay. It's, you know, it's marginal gains. It's what here or what there, and that can go either way. And I remember because I've probably had 5 or 6 years where every single test I was always finding 5 to 10 watts in my FTP test. And then there comes a point where that 5 to 10 watts becomes 3 watts and you're thinking, do I need to change something in my training? And then it's 2 watts, then it's the same FTP or even slightly lower, depending on how the performance went. And it'd be very tempting to do a bit of a Lionel Sanders, throw the training plan in the air and say, I need a new coach or I need to be vegan. You can do that if you want.
I love that, to do a Lionel. That should be a phrase. That should be a phrase, to do a Lionel.
Don't do a Lionel. He's amazing, but don't do a Lionel. And it would be very easy to think that something needs to change because I'm plateauing. But again, we're in an endurance sport and it takes a lot of time. So the way that I've got excited about FTP tests and how I make progress is I'm remembering that the majority of my races are 5 to 10 hours long, and I'm testing for 20 minutes, and that's still relevant and it's still a good metric to use. But at the end of the day, I can still be a much quicker athlete with the same FTP. And so remember, we're not robots. There's so much more that we can work on than just smashing the pedals for 20 minutes. There's how's the bike handling? Can you go around corners without touching the brakes at the wrong times? How's the nutrition? After 3 hours, do you start to get stomach cramps? What are you doing to do that? How's the electrolytes? Are you making sure that you're getting them at exactly the right time? How's the racecraft? How's the pacing? How's the nutrition? How's the recovery? There's so much more that actually my FTP could be down 5 watts. It could be the same, but my race day performance could be significantly different depending on all the other elements that I'm focusing on. So look at FTP for what it is that 20-minute really important effort, but you can still be a much quicker triathlete or endurance sport athlete if you look at everything else that's going on. So don't get too, I mean, I think I'm repeating myself, but don't get too bogged down in this FTP.
Yeah. I loved your story about one of the races that you did where you were determined to put out the lowest possible watts amongst the top finishers, rather than it being a willy waving contest of who's got the biggest numbers. It became how fast can I go? Can I keep up putting out, I forget what your number was. It was 150 watts or something, wasn't it? Can I cruise along with the group at whatever it was? That's a really intelligent mindset that says, yes, okay, my numbers might not be as high as before. And I think this informs the older age group athletes here. I might not have the same amount of power to play with. Can I be smarter? Can I be more wily? Can I find a way to stay in the aero position longer, to, you know, whatever it is, it's possible to do that. Yeah. There's one thing you touched on here that I'm going to add on as well. I think the biggest determinant of gains in training is something that most people don't track, and that's how much sleep they get. And it's almost like this turbocharger for training, but it's the thing that gets cut in modern society as a sign of, you know, the Margaret Thatcher, I only need 4 hours of sleep a night kind of thing.
You become the lazy athlete if you're sleeping the whole time.
If you can get more sleep, and it wouldn't surprise me at all, I've got no data to back this up, but it wouldn't surprise me at all if results in tests were correlated with sleep hours, and the extra hour of sleep or the ability to find the time to have a nap in the afternoon once a week. Brilliant. Yet it's something that can't sell on a website, doesn't come wrapped in carbon, isn't lightweight, isn't sexy, but it's something that makes massive, massive performance gains to people.
Yeah, totally. I like that a lot. And it's not easy. We have a lot of training to do. We've got a lot to balance, but if you can prioritize that, it does go a long way. Especially, again, we talk about consistency, and it's not just consistency of turning up for your bike session and swim, but it's also consistency of sleep. So if you can do that night after night, then yeah, it's naturally going to have a very positive impact.
Yeah, 100%. Right then, I think that brings us just about to the end of this week's episode, doesn't it, really?
Yeah, it's a good one. I hope that people have enjoyed their last 16 weeks. It's not easy. I'm in a similar kind of boat where, you know, I'm analyzing a little bit of, have I under-egged it? Have I over-egged it in terms of my motivation, my application? But I think if athletes listen to this and, you know, take a little bit of a step back and think, what would they like to change for their next 16 weeks? Now's the time to start thinking about that and be accountable and write it down and, you know, talk to your coaches about it, talk to your fellow athletes. And I think being accountable goes a very, very long way, and not just having an idea in your head and then leaving it there.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And I think I'd leave people with the idea of this. If you've done any amount of training across the winter and you've left yourself in the position where you can go out for a ride with your mates or a run with your mates and enjoy any period of time, a few hours, half an hour, running, riding, swimming with your friends outdoors and enjoying the feeling of being physically fit, that's ultimately the payback of this. The races are just the motivation to get you onto the trainer and get you out the door every day. But if you're fit enough to go out and train with your friends and enjoy the outdoors, you've done a great job. And I love to see people's numbers increasing. But more than that, I love to see people happily moving in the outdoors and under their own steam, essentially. So that's the ultimate marker, I think, of the winter block. You've managed to train every day when it was bloody difficult to, and now you're in great shape to start enjoying the days getting lighter, having more daylight hours. Summer's hopefully on the way when the snowstorm goes, and you'll be in a really, really good position going forwards. Now, in the next episode, we're going to talk about looking forwards, training plans going forward to race events, how that's going to change, the differences between the winter plan that's now finished and the race specific plans, both in terms of changing durations of sessions, but also the makeup of the sessions and what they're specifically for. And I think we can get into the nuance of it's not just about FTP, as you've said, the different things people can do to add extra strings to the bow that means come 12, 14, 16, 20 weeks, whatever it is to their race, they'll be in really great shape to add on race-specific fitness on top of the winter fitness that they've already built.
Sounds great, Rob. Look forward to it.
Good. Thanks very much for joining us, Chris. We'll catch up again with you next week.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.